Now, there is a video on YouTube. It was a KGB defector back in the 80s who was talking about the systematic and wholesale demoralization of the West by the communist powers in Russia, but elsewhere around the world. You can look him up on YouTube. We can just maybe throw this up for a minute. It's Yuri Besmenov, and he talks about this interview that he did back in the 1980s, talking about the demoralization of the West and how this leads to control and how it leads to essentially a communist takeover of the West. The interesting thing about demoralization, he picked that out of a dictionary, because to demoralize someone, work with us here for a minute. When you demoralize someone, you are lowering their spirit. You are bringing them down. This has nothing to do with morals. To demoralize means to deflate, to bring people down, to make people lose heart, to make people lose faith in themselves, make them lose all self-respect. To demoralize, in other words, is to despirit. He used the term demoralization, but after everything that we've shown and been discussing, to demoralize is to despirit. And when someone is divided and conquered, they are divided from their spirit, they're divided from their being. That separation has taken place, that divorce has taken place, because they have been so attached, so hypnotized, become so mesmerized by the stimulation and so identified with the simulation, and they believe that that's all they are, is this body, this mind, these emotions, these sensations, and the stimulation of those things. Someone keeps chasing that, and someone is constantly living in desire, but they're always demoralized, they're dispirited, and they're suffering. It's all suffering because nothing can ever satisfy. If someone is demoralized, someone has no center of gravity that's a permanent center of gravity. Someone only has a black hole in the center of their heart. And no matter what you fill it with, no matter how much you try to stimulate yourself in order to fill that hole in your heart, it's never going to be enough. And the nature of stimulation is that one day this much stimulation is enough, but then the next time you need this much stimulation, and then the next time this much, and this much, and this much, and this much, and every time you go back to the trough, you need a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more intense, and a little bit more this, or a little bit more of that, and it's never enough, and you always need more and more and more and more, because if you go back and just try to have the same amount of stimulation, it just doesn't satisfy, not even temporarily. It's just boring. It's the same old, same old. No, we need more stimulation. And that constant chasing of that stimulation and never being satisfied is this demoralization, because it's very disheartening. These words all exist for a reason. When you're disheartened, when you lose heart, you lose the vivacity, the passion for life, the joie de vivre, right? You're living in constant perpetual stress at that point, because you're constantly trying to stay out ahead of suffering. But that's like a dog trying to run away from its tail, because the void is in your heart. The suffering is there. It is the absence of spirit. We said at the outset. It's interesting how we start off writing really big, but then as we progress through we still write big. So then the result is what we wrote at the beginning of the live stream gets really, really, really small. So let's go back to the outset here. And we said that inspired, the opposite of inspired is not uninspired. It is despirited, because the meaning of inspired is in spirit. And that the relationship between dispirited, to be in spirit, and despirited is the relation to be evolved or evolving, and devolved or devolving. That's the relationship. To be suffering then, to suffer, we said, is to be demoralized, to be dispirited. And we also said disheartened, right? The absence of spirit. But here is where we tie it all together using words, using language, using linguistics, and language doesn't lie. You can't make this stuff up. This is not a coincidence. Another word for suffer is to despair, to be dispirited, to be despair, to despair. Despair is born out of the word dispirited. And another way, and literally, why is it despaired? Because to be in spirit, we have, let's see if we can pull this off here. We have a mortal vessel and we have a spirit inside. This is a pair, right? Two as one, united, union with spirit, to be paired in union with spirit. To be dispirited is to be despaired, to be over here, empty, just a black hole in the heart. And the black hole is a downward spiral. It's what cannot be filled. When we suffer, we are in despair, we are separated. It is that suffering that is telling us the state of our existence, which is not being, because our spirit is the essence of our being. To be one with spirit, to be in union with spirit. This is where we get the words yug and relegare. Yug is Sanskrit, relegare is Latin. And these are the root words of yoga and religion, respectively. And they both mean to bind together as one, to bound together as one, as in the ties that bind, like the bonds of holy matrimony. Union with spirit, union with divinity. So suffering, the causes of suffering, of despair, separate us. They cause the breaking of the bonds which unite us to ourself, to our spirit, to our being. And we end up as these intellectual animals who are suffering out in the wilderness. Our being is desired, and we end up conditioned and demoralized, disheartened, and divided and conquered. And all if we give into, identify with that stimulation, that simulation, that false self, this false reality. But the same suffering that can make us wind up with all of this, that same suffering can inspire us and seek us to unite. And we talked about that last week, how suffering can inspire and unite others, but it can also inspire and unite us. Because remember, it's a double-edged sword. It's just that we mustn't lose sight of the reality of the situation. We mustn't lose sight of the state of this humanity, the fact that we're in the Kali Yuga, and the fact that for the vast majority of people, they are dispirited, they are disheartened, they are suffering, they are demoralized, they are trapped in the simulation, they are obsessed with stimulation to the point where the streaming services are just churning out content and people are lapping it up. And now AI is coming along and churning out content at an unbelievable rate. And people are just consuming it and consuming it and consuming it. And it is all completely empty. It is completely devoid of spirit.